welcome to your Access Point to Washington. I'm Aisha Tanzim. While the world is fixated on the outcome of the U.S. presidential elections, another, and compared to the noise of the U.S. campaigns, almost silent leadership change is taking place on the other side of the globe. A change that has the potential to impact the world affairs just as much. A change in the top leadership of the Communist Party of China. Let's take a look at a brief introduction by VOA's Joy Wagner.
Every 10 years, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party changes in a week-long gathering of the top leadership called the Communist Party Congress. November 8th marks the beginning of the 18th Congress in the party's 91-year history. Leadership of the party will transition from the current Chinese premier, Hu Jintao, to his successor, Xi Jinping. Officially, the 2,280 delegates of the Communist Party are supposed to vote on the leadership after discussions. Unofficially, the outcome of the Congress has already been decided behind closed doors by the few dozen power brokers. While most know of the new party leader, Mr. Xi, speculation is going around on who will be the members of his Politburo Standing Committee, the group of people who oversee the Communist Party of China. The 18th Congress will also lay down the party's agenda for the next 5 years. Joy Wagner, VOA News, Washington.
Joining me in our studios to talk about what the change can possibly mean for the world are Don Bonker, a former U.S. congressman and a leading authority on international trade and investment. And he has broad experience on foreign policy issues. Also, he's an executive director at APCO Worldwide. And Andrew Small, a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. He works on U.S.-China and EU-China relations, Chinese policy in South and Southwest Asia, and China's role in problem and fragile states. And joining us over the phone is Dr. Doug Guthrie, the Dean of the George Washington University School of Business. He specializes in the field of economic reform in China. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Congressman, with the simple questions. Why should we care?
Well, China is the emerging superpower. At some point, they're going to surpass the United States. It has all to do with their state capitalism versus our market capitalism, and our competitive nature and the interdependence economically. So for America, it's our #1 priority.
We had a third presidential debate in America over foreign policy issues, and yet there's a new leadership in China. Do we have any idea what their foreign policy priorities might be?
Almost none. They've kept their cards very close to their chest. Foreign policy really isn't one of the top priorities for them. They're going to be heavily focused on internal political and economic issues. What we know is China's foreign policy situation generally and what's going to be on their plate. And a lot of that's going to be the increasingly difficult relationship with the United States and China's increasingly nervous neighbors.
Dr. Guthrie, we're talking about increasingly difficult relationship with the United States. We've also heard that the change is veiled in secrecy. First of all, why do you think the secrecy is warranted? And then we'll come to what it means for a U.S.-China relationship.
Well, whether or not the secrecy is warranted, I think, is an interesting question. I think that China has a penchant for this kind of secrecy because there's a long history in China that dates back to the Opium Wars and maybe even before that of a tremendous amount of nervousness about being kind of pushed around by the West and told what to do. And certainly Mao Zedong's rise to power was really on a wave of anti-foreign sentiment. And so a lot of the Communist Party's identity has been tied up in actually doing what they want to do and not really involving the world in those kinds of processes or questions, and then kind of rolling it out as a fait accompli. I think that approach actually hurts them today because I think a lot more change is going on in China, not only economically in terms of liberalization, but also even politically, and they just don't have an interest in letting the world see that. And so the secrecy, I think, makes it look like it's just this kind of oligarchic authoritarian regime that hasn't changed at all, when in fact actually it hides a lot of the changes that have happened.
And whether they want the world to see it or not, the bottom line is that China's actions affect the world. And recently we've seen China as one of the big countries blocking U.S. and Europe's efforts, Congressman, in terms of Syria, in terms of Security Council. Do you see in the new relationship in the coming days with the new leadership? Any let up of that?
Yes, I think it represents a true opportunity because you have two enlightened leaders who want to solve problems and not promote confrontation. Too often that's happened with Russia and China over the years. But I think Mr. Xi and Mr. Obama will be able to manage these differences in the short term. In the long term, you have a state capitalism, you have a highly centralized government, a suppression of rights versus all the norms of democracy in America, and they will continue to represent difficulties and challenges in our relationship.
Now, he's talking about two enlightened leaders, and the world doesn't know Mr. Xi as much as it knows Mr. Obama. Would you agree with him that they're two enlightened leaders who might change the direction?
I mean, the big difference that you have with Xi Jinping as party chief, by contrast to his predecessor, Hu Jintao, is he's a much more internationalized background. He's a princeling. He's come from a sort of eminent Communist Party stock. He's going to be a more self-confident leader. What you've seen in the last 10 years is a huge level of caution from the leadership. That's still going to be true, but I think the one thing that people expect of the new Politburo and of Xi personally is that there's going to be a bit more self-confidence about possibly some of the reforms, possibly about China standing on the international stage, and in some ways even personally in terms of the international relationships. Hu Jintao's been a very stiff leader for people to deal with. Xi Jinping is someone where there may be better relationship building with President Obama and with other foreign leaders. And we've even seen that during his earlier visit to the United States.
To the United States. Well, Dr. Guthrie, I want to come to you. During the U.S. election campaign, Governor Mitt Romney declared that if elected, he will declare China a currency manipulator on day one. And we also know that U.S. is now going to impose heavy tariffs on Chinese solar cell imports. Do you see mounting pressure on President Obama to get tough with China?
There may be pressure, but I think it's actually very much misplaced. First of all, I think the currency manipulation discussion is just a silly debate. I think that the economics of it are just quite strange, and people don't really understand how important it is not just to have continuing good relations with China, but also how important our own companies that are doing business in China are. And most of them are the companies that are exporting back to the United States. So if you take one example, Walmart is the #1 exporter from China to the United States. Walmart is not going anywhere in China to leave China because it has to actually capture China's internal market. And so if China was to appreciate the yuan too quickly, that's just going to increase prices for the poorest American consumers. And so I think that this is just a kind of bogeyman kind of debate. It gets people upset and excited. But the real issue is the question of having pragmatic engagement that is really kind of the hard work of just doing business with a very complicated partner. The one thing that I just want to say to respond to one of your other guests is that I have a little bit of a different view in terms of the centralization, and I think it's often a misconception of China because China's actually a very decentralized economy, and it really hasn't been since Zhu Rongji, soon 2 premiers ago, that there has been a strong central player. And so although it looks like a centralized authoritarian government, Beijing doesn't have so much control over what goes on in the provinces as we think. And so it just takes, I think, really hard work from the senior leadership of our country to really kind of get down in the weeds and work with China as a partner because whether we like it or not, they are our most important trading partner by far.
Okay, so now he's brought us to a very important point, which is the relationship between U.S. and China is so strange. It's not like USSR. They're kind of like joined at the hip. They can fight, but they cannot get rid of each other. Do you see that relationship continuing, and how do you see it going forward?
Well, this is why it's so challenging. America is sending mixed signals to China. In Washington, we're all about unfair trade practices and national security concerns. China's biggest technology company cannot even get into the U.S. because of national security concerns.
And didn't they recently take, because there's an Air Force base and they were testing drones,
Yes,
they took
that went through the CFIUS process, and they shut down a Chinese wind farm along the Columbia River in Oregon. At the same time, the German companies own wind farms and nothing is happening. We are treating China in a highly discriminatory way. This is out of Washington. But the other message comes from the governors and the mayors, and they're sending trade missions, and businesses are looking to China to bring investments into the country. And so for these Chinese state-owned enterprise, they're getting mixed signals. And they're finding that their investments are in the national security areas, not military, but energy and technology. They're going to have nothing but resistance in trying to get into the market.
So he's talking about the mixed signals, and I want you to elaborate a little bit. We've also heard President Obama say, well, America is solidifying its position in the Asia Pacific, and they're going there. The Chinese are saying, what are you doing in our backyard? The mixed signals, why is America doing that? What is the fear? And the mixed signals, what's going out of Washington versus what's going out of the trade missions from the States, how will America in the end kind of join them?
I think, I'm not sure they will be joined for some time to come. I think you're going to have these two parallel tracks where in one sense you have a thriving economic relationship with a lot of tensions on trade issues as well, but nevertheless a booming relationship in which more investment will be coming in from the Chinese side to the United States, which will be a big shift. But at the same time, there are genuine national security concerns about China, and especially in the Asia Pacific, where it's going to be a testing time for the United States. It has been already in the last couple of years, and it will be even more so in the years ahead, to be able to reassure US allies in the region that the United States has the staying power, has the commitment, and is willing to swing in behind them on what are the increasing level of Chinese assertiveness over especially maritime issues, which we've seen in South China Sea, the East China Sea with Japan. This is going to be a difficult and in some ways bifurcated relationship, maintaining that economic track and keeping that working, but at the same time ensuring that the national security...
And China is spending a lot, Dr. Guthrie, I would like to bring you in. China is spending a lot of money on its military recently. He talked about South China Sea. We saw a couple of skirmishes along that, between Taiwan and Japan and China. Do you see that situation getting any better? And what is really the fear of the Chinese neighbors in that region?
Yeah, so the first issue, I just want to put in context the notion that China's spending a lot of money on its military. Military spending, of course, has gone up in real terms, but it's pretty much been proportionate with the growth of the economy. They spend about 8% of GDP on their military, which, if you look at the growth of the economy, it looks like a dramatic shift in spending, but it's been pretty steady. Now, some people say, well, actually, you're underestimating the numbers but whatever the number actually is, whether it's 8, 9, or 10%, it hasn't been a very aggressive of investment beyond the growth of the economy, and it still is a very, very small amount. It's about somewhere between a tenth and a fifth the size of what we spend on the military. So I think that there's a lot of sort of fear-mongering around that question that we need to be careful about. But the second issue is, China is a country that's very, very serious about sovereignty, and it's very serious about sovereignty in a couple of key questions. Taiwan is one of them. The South China Sea is one of them. Tibet is an issue. I think that's a thorny issue that, a lot of nations around the world deal with. We have lots of secessionist kinds of movements in different places, and countries have gone to civil wars over those kinds of issues, including our own. And so I think that, I know that these are very, very hot-button, high-emotion kinds of issues, and we need to kind of deal with them in a very pragmatic and kind of continually at-the-table kind of way. But I think we always need to be a little careful in characterizing China as a really kind of outlandish actor in this realm.
Here's another thing. U.S. has been trying to use, some people say, India as kind of a counterbalance to China in that region. And some people also suggest that the U.S.-India nuclear deal was part of that process. It was, sped up so that, U.S.-China relationship could cement. What could U.S.-India relationship throw at the mix?
You mean in terms of Chinese reach
exactly
into other areas?
Exactly.
I think this will represent a challenge for the U.S. because we are so engaged ourselves in the Middle East, and many of our resources are being poured into that region, and China is wisely pouring their resources into investments and acquiring more commodities. So I think China wisely sidesteps the political issues where America is all anxious to get engaged in regions and apply often security resources. Why isn't China being drawn into Syria and into Libya and these other countries?
And actually blocking U.S.'s efforts in Syria.
Well, on votes involving the UN, but not blocking in any physical way. But they wisely sidestep these things, and this is going to be a benchmark on how the U.S. is going into descent while China is on the increase. They've got their priorities right in terms of their global presence compared to the U.S.
And now China may be on the ascent, but the new leadership is going to face a lot of challenges. Now, VOA's William Ide put together this really good report on what the challenges of the new leadership is. And as he says, we don't really know how the leadership plans to tackle those challenges. Let's take a look at what he's brought for us.
As China gears up for its biggest political party in 10 years, its leaders are trying to keep the public focus on the party's accomplishments and the country's bright future. The Congress is the closest thing the country has to the excitement of a political campaign in a democratic country, where policies are discussed and debated ahead of time, says China analyst David Kelly.
Even though we foresee at the moment, without final confirmation, that there will be a fairly conservative team, they are not facing routine questions, they're facing some momentous questions.
China has seen growing tensions with its neighbors in recent months, in particular Japan, about disputed islands in the East China Sea. Its massive economy, the second largest in the world, is also facing uncertainties. But Kelly says that has helped strengthen the case for reform.
Reform in China is not a mild issue. It's going to hurt some people and benefit others. And the balance of these two is going to be decided by the people who now step up into the Politburo Standing Committee and the other important parts of the party.
How much China's leader-in-waiting, Xi Jinping, is willing to make a break with the past is unclear. Xi's father was politically prominent, and that makes him what the Chinese call a princeling. Many people in China tend to view princelings as elitist, but Chinese economist Hu Xingdou says princelings tend to be more reform-minded than other party factions, which are cautious and afraid of losing power.
The princelings are different. Since they were kids, they thought that this country was theirs, because it was their parents that laid the foundation for this world. For them, the ownership is clear. This country is theirs.
But some princelings, such as Bo Xilai, have taken that sense of entitlement to an extreme. And because of his case and countless others, there is growing public discontent in China about wealth inequality and corruption. Bo was once a rising political star in China who now faces a wide range of accusations from corruption and other wrongdoing. On Sunday, he was formally expelled from the Communist Party and is expected to soon face criminal charges. Although most analysts say they do not expect to see any dramatic reforms from China's new leaders right away, they do hope for more transparency. One significant change would be for officials from the top to the bottom to make their finances public, says lawyer Wang Cailiang.
The moment they open up the finances of public servants to public scrutiny, and once they install a system like that, then it will be very significant change for the Chinese public. There are many who hope for a multi-party political system, but I don't think that is the key. The key here is that if you are a civil servant, then you have to submit to public scrutiny. If you don't, you will have to step out of office.
Analysts say that although there are many ways officials could make sure such changes never happen, popular sentiment for clean governance is growing. William Ide, VOA News, Beijing.
Now, in his address to the Congress this morning, Premier Hu Jintao has talked about opening up. But at the same time, he's used a lot of key phrases that the Congress has used in the past for that to avoid reform, to avoid opening up. Which way, Congressman, starting with you, which way do you see China going?
Well, we certainly don't have an insider's view.
Right.
And there's not a lot of transparency, but I think there's enough information out there to appreciate that there's a big debate within their party, and especially their standing committee, which will be the elites who rule the country. And there are reform advocates strongly committed to privatizing the state-owned enterprises. And there are the political hardliners. And one of the big issues is when they form this new standing committee, is it going to be more oriented to reform or the hardliners? And when we know that, we'll get a better sense of the direction.
But at the same time, we also see dissent within China growing, protests that a few years ago we didn't see the likes of it, like thousands of people getting out. Was it in northern Sichuan province that the plant, they were opening the plant and the protesters got there, said it's very bad for the environment and closed up. How long can China resist that kind of protest? And since he said we don't have an insider's view, do we know how bad it is inside China? How if people are really willing to come out in larger numbers?
They're even willing to publish, I mean, the government is willing to publish the numbers themselves of the number of protests on a low estimate, but it's enormous. They recognize that it's a problem. Nevertheless, if you're talking about reform, there are two separate questions. One is a political reform question, one is an economic reform question. The initial impression we have, as came up in the clip, is that it is possible that there will be a relatively reformist standing committee on the economic front. And there's a lot of people who are willing to look at questions around state-owned enterprises, rebalancing of the economy, these sorts of questions. On the political reform, the sort of internal party reforms, transparency of the party, these sorts of things, there's a sense that there's still not a huge amount of willingness. They know the pressures are there, but there's still a strong view from many in the party that this is still something that just needs to be clamped down on. And we'll see next week probably what the lineup looks like. But at present on the political side, it's really not looking very reformist. The only question, of course, is on the economic reform is not just economic reform. Economic reform to take on the vested interests that have preserved the system for the last, especially in the last decade, since Jiang Zemin. That's a political reform question as well. There are powerful political interests there as well. So even if the new leadership accepts the importance of taking this on for the rebalancing of the Chinese economy, whether they're willing to make some of those tough decisions and take on, I mean, some of the other leaders who benefit from it within the country is another question.
Dr. Guthrie, I want you to kind of chime in here and say, when we talk about economic reform, how can China limit that not to include political reform, and how far is China willing to go in terms of its political reform?
Well, let me just take a step back here, because I actually do think that economic reform and political reform can go hand in hand. They don't always. And so if you look at what happened in the transition from the 80s to the 90s, so when Zhao Ziyang was basically deposed for coming out as part of the reformist faction after the Tiananmen massacre, Zhu Rongji came into power, and he didn't say much about politics at all. He just said, we're focusing on the economy. But if you look at the laws that were passed in the name of economic growth under Zhu Rongji, these laws were pregnant with individual civil liberties, and many of them were not necessary for economic growth. We have laws like the National Compensation Law, which allowed residents to sue the government for past wrongs. We have laws like the Prison Reform Law. And so he never talked about democracy and never talked about political reform, but it's clear in the aftermath that he had just gotten smarter. He was part of the liberal reform part of the party, but he just didn't want to ever address this in an open way. And so there's a way in which economic reforms can really drive political reforms if you have leadership that does that. Now, he was followed by a group, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. They were just very weak on this, and I think that China has actually slid back over the last decade. And so I think it remains to be seen as to how Hu Jintao and how Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang are going to, assuming it's Li Keqiang, are going to address this. The one additional thing that I think is the pressure is really on for these guys is that it has been a decade of weak leadership, and a lot of reforms like banking reform didn't really happen the way they should have happened, and there was a backslide in state-owned enterprise reform, and so I think the pressure is on to actually really right that ship. But there's also an incredible it must be a frightening discussion for them right now among a lot of wealthy elites in the country who are sort of apolitical, but they just want to get out. I mean, there's a lot of cash and a lot of people with children who are sending their kids to elite private schools in America and Europe that just want some kind of stability, and they're a little bit afraid. And I think that if China doesn't take that seriously, they're going to have a real problem with losing a generation of leadership that's not political leadership, but it's sort of the economic elite. I feel a little more optimistic with Xi Jinping, but I think it is still a black box. The proof is going to be in what they actually do.
Do you agree that there might be a chance of a brain drain? And given, we read the New York Times story about the $3 billion, was it, that the 2.7 that the Chinese premier and his family has accumulated, and New York Times has blocked, and then we have the case of Bo Xilai. How big of an issue good governance has become in China?
Listen, whenever you have a concentration of wealth and power, you're going to have mischief. You're going to have corruption. And interestingly, the leadership is speaking out against corruption. They are taking selectively some action. But at the same time, the New York Times article about Mr. Hu, what is that all about? But the one person in China said, well, we ought to have leaders disclose their personal finances. That's not going to happen. If you have an independent and free media, they become the watchdog, just like they do in this country. But at least the leaders there are conscious of corruption, and they know when there's that much wealth, it's going to happen, and they're trying to put the brake on. And I think that is a good sign.
You agree?
The interesting thing about the New York Times story was, of course, that it took on Wen Jiabao. Wen Jiabao has been seen as one of the cleaner leaders. The princelings as a whole tend to be seen as more corrupt, more tied to a lot of the economic interests, business interests. By taking on Wen Jiabao with this story, it to some extent exposed the fact that there's no one clean at the top levels of the party. Now, it didn't necessarily point to a lot of personal wrongdoing on Wen Jiabao's part, but when you talk about anti-corruption efforts and the selectivity of anti-corruption efforts, those anti-corruption efforts are directed much lower down the chain, or they're used for political purposes, as we're seeing with Bo Xilai, as we've seen with one or two other former figures like Chen Liangyu, the party secretary in Shanghai. You don't see the big fish taken out for corruption reasons. And I think the reaction on many people's part will be, I think they probably thought it anyway, but if Wen Jiabao is and his family are guilty to this degree, no one is exempt. No
one's accepted. Well, we can talk about it, for a long time, but unfortunately our time for today is up. We may come back to this topic, though, when we know what the new leadership is and what their plans are, and I hope some of our guests can join us. Before they leave us, I want to thank our guests, Congressman Don Bonker and Andrew Small of the German Marshall Fund, and Dr. Guthrie, who joined us from New York by the phone, of George Washington University. And thank you for watching. Make sure you leave your comments about this show on our Facebook page, also your ideas for any of our future pages. Don't forget to check out our website, urduvoa.com. Goodbye.